talk today about two topics. The first topic is erasing God's name. If I wrote God's name, are you allowed to erase God's name? And we're going to talk about erasing God's name in Hebrew. But what happens if somebody wrote God's name in a language other than Hebrew? So let's say, Shalom uvracha, perfect timing. Achshav itchalnu. But let's say I write God's name not in Hebrew, but I write God's name in English, or in French, or in Arabic. Would I be allowed to erase God's name written in a language other than Hebrew? Or is it the letters that make it holy, or the symbolism? Meaning, the question is it putting these letters together creates something that I can't erase? Or is it any symbol that represents God would be a problem in any language? And then, according to that, is there any difference between G-O-D, God, G-O-D, or G-D? Is there any value in doing the dash? Okay, that's question one. And then the second thing that we're going to talk about is if a book, a holy book, has come to the end of its life. Every once in a while, you open up a holy book that you've been learning for many years. You open it up, and then the pages go all over the place, and you realize it's going to be difficult to continue learning from that book. How do I then dispose of holy books that have lived their lives? And then after speaking about holy books, we would talk about, if there was a newspaper with the Devar Torah in it, would I be allowed to throw away the newspaper? Or if there's often on Friday nights, you might see in shuls here in Israel, there's lots and lots of magazines produced. Some of these magazines with Divrei Torah, they're weekly magazines. What do I do when I finish reading the weekly magazine at the end of Shabbat? Or indeed, this very, very piece of paper at the end of the shiur, what's an appropriate way to dispose of it's not a book, but it's like a paper that contains Torah. What's an appropriate way to dispose of that? So those are the two questions: erasing God's name and disposing of holy books. And this fits in very nicely to last week's discussion when we spoke about the Sefer Torah and Sefer Kodesh, how to show respect to a holy book that I'm using. So now at the end of a holy book's life, how do I treat it? Okay. So we're going to start. If you turn to page number 2, do you see it says erasing God's name? Point 3. So what's the source for the prohibition of erasing God's name? Once we understand the prohibition, why we're not allowed to erase God's name, and also really we come from there from the prohibition of erasing God's name, we come to the law of how to dispose of holy books. You follow what I'm saying? Because it's God's name in the holy books that makes it a problem to throw it away. So let's start with the pasuk. The pasuk in Sefer Devarim. In Sefer Devarim, as you know, the last few days of the life of Moshe Rabbeinu, we are preparing to enter the land of Israel. We're about to conquer the land of Israel. The whole of the book of Devarim is just a few days in time of Moshe Rabbeinu preparing us. And as you know, the land of Israel was full of lots of idol worship. And when we entered the land of Israel with Joshua, we wanted to purify the land of Israel from the idol worship of the land. And on that, the Torah tells us like this. Devarim Yud Bet Gimel, chapter 12, verse 3. V'nitzatztem et mizbechotam. You need to destroy the altars of Avodah Zarah. V'shibartem et matzevotam. And you have to break their monuments. V'asherehem tisrum v'esh, and burn their holy trees. Uv'silei Elohehem tikateun v'ibatetem et shemam min hamakom hahu. You want to erase Avodah Zarah. Now, I just one point about Avodah Zarah in brackets. I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again because every time we talk about this, we should mention it. It sounds quite violent. Now, on this destruction of everything, it's important to know that we today don't really have the same type of Avodah Zarah that was described at the time of the Torah. And if we read through the books of the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, I don't see nowadays people are drawn uncontrollably to bow down to idols, even though that's something that we speak about quite frequently. In biblical times, we don't see the same draw to that particular sin nowadays, and the Gemara tells us in Beitzah that Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hara for idol worship, isn't the same today as it was then. So therefore, when we talk about this destruction of Avodah Zarah, remember that we can't really understand exactly what that means nowadays, because we don't have that same desire for Avodah Zarah today as we had then. But that's as an aside. Now we get to the verse that's important to us. That's all about their side. Now, just a few words. Pasuk Dalet, verse 4, the following verse, Lo ta'asun kein Hashem Elokechem. All this stuff that we said about destroying them, don't do any of that towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we are required to remove that which is bad, but any sort of action that would be to blot out them, obviously we don't do that for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, this prohibition of erasing God's name, or of, not throwing away holy books, or treating treating places of worship and treating Sefer Kodesh with respect, all comes from this verse over here, that all this destruction that we're required to do to uproot evil, don't do any of that for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the pasuk, right? But from the pasuk, we then come to practical halacha. Meaning, how do we implement this idea? What exactly are we forbidden from doing in respect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So the Rambam says two things. The first thing, and we mentioned this last week, but I'll just mention it briefly, is he tells us what exactly are God's names. And he says there are 7 names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when we say you're not allowed to erase God's name, what does it mean to erase God's name? This is God's name. 7 words. One of them is Yud Kei Vav Kei. And then we've got O Hanichtav Adonai, V'Kel Eloka, Elokim, Elokai, Shakai Tzvaot. All of those words are words that are a reflection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'chol ha'mochek afilu ot achad mishiva elu lokeh. Anyone who erases one of these a letter of any of these names of God is punished. Okay, clear, Joy? Okay, but now how's that? So I mean, that's what we're not allowed to do. We're not allowed to erase those names. But practically, what am I allowed to throw away? What am I not allowed to throw away? So the Rambam explains in the following halacha. He writes like this. It's right at the beginning of the Mishneh Torah. Kitvei HaKodesh, holy writings, kulam ufeirushehem uviruehem asur l'sarfam o la'avdam beyad va'amabdan beyad makin oto makat mardut. The rabbis tell us you're not allowed to destroy any holy writing. Holy writing normally refers to Tanakh and the Mishnah and the Gemara. Any of the Torah, the written Torah or the oral Torah. That is our holy writings, and any interpretations or explanations of those books are included, and you're not allowed to burn or destroy any of those books. So even if I have a page of Chumash, or a page of Navi, or a Megillat Esther, that God's name doesn't appear once. So it's not just God's name, as we saw in the previous statement of the Rambam, but if I have the Megillat Esther that doesn't contain God's name in it, I'm not allowed to throw away that book because it is one of the holy books. You follow? So it's God's name plus holy writings. And we're going to define how we define holy writings later. במה דברים אמורים בכתבי הקודש שכתבם ישרוע בקדושה, אבל אפיקורס ישרוע שכתב ספר תורה, שורפין אותו עם האזכרות שבו, מפני שאינו מאמין בקדושת השם ולא כתבו לשמו, אלא שהוא מעלה בדעתו שזה כשאר הדברים, והואיל ודעתו כן לא נתקדש השם. Now this is a very, very important point. He says, You're not allowed to destroy any holy writings. What holy writings? A holy writing is holy for two reasons. It's holy for the content, nachon, a Mishnah, Gemara, a book of Navi, the book of Joshua, book of Psalms, book of Devarim. All of these are holy books, right? So they're holy, but they need two things. First of all, it has to be a holy book, and it has to be written by a holy person as well. Sheketavam Yisrael b'kedusha, written by a Jew in holiness. Now, of course, the Rambam, writing in the 11th century, lived a few hundred years before the printing press. So for every book that the Rambam is talking about, he's only talking about a handwritten book, obviously, because those are the only books that are available then. So the books that are forbidden from destroying are books written by Torah observant Jews. However, and this is crazy, if a heretic, Apikores, a Jewish heretic, wrote a Sefer Torah, do you know what we need to do? We are commanded to burn it, to destroy it. And he even goes quite strong on this. He's got very harsh words for this. Mitzvah lesorfo, it's a command, meaning it is a noble act to destroy it. Kedei shelo lahaniach sham la'apikorosim v'lo la'maaseim, in order to get rid of their sort of ideology. Because, a lot of their books are handwritten, they have an agenda if they're going to be writing the books. So to destroy a holy book written by a heretic would be a continuation of our requirement to blot out idol worship. You follow? Because holy books bring us closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore a book written by a heretic is not written, it's not written with the intent to make us closer, and therefore we are required to destroy those books. So when the Rambam said at the beginning that I'm not allowed to erase God's name, it's only if God's name was written with intent of God's name. I think I mentioned last week how there are Bibles printed in Hebrew by missionaries. So those Bibles written in Hebrew by missionaries have no holiness in them. Even though it could say Yud Kei Vav Kei, could say all the names of God, I would, according to Rambam over here, there's a mitzvah to destroy those books. Not just that you are allowed to, but it's a mitzvah to destroy those books because those are not under the category of holy books. In order for a book to be a holy book, it's both the content and the author. Author is not the right word, because the author is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But I mean the person who produced, not just the actual text, but also the person who brought the text into being. And it's those two things together which make it a holy book. Now what's interesting, we'll come back to this again later on, that intent is an important aspect of what makes a holy book holy. Not just the actual words on the paper, but the intent of the author has an impact on the holiness of the book. Is that clear? Okay, so far, the words of the Rambam. Yes. Yes. Oh, Chaim.
I ask a question.
It'll be an honor.
What is the extent of the heretic? If you would say that, let's say, some reform or Mashiachists are heretics,
Oh, wow.
that would make a bunch of books to be burned.
That's a very, very good question. I think the Rambam wrote the 13 Principles of Faith. I'm not sure if there's questions about where they're from, but in general, people that accept the 13 Principles of Faith are, that the Torah is from heaven, and that Moshe Rabbeinu is the most important of the prophets, that Moshiach is going to come. So I think the 13 Principles of Faith are a good measure of what's a heretic. I know in recent years there have been a couple of books to try to define exactly what a heretic is nowadays. I'll tell you what I think, really, and that is, it's very hard to like to describe, to put it down in paper. Normally, there's certain things that when you see it, you know what you follow. So sometimes instinct. I know you want more. Instinct would be more is not very scientific, but it's not something that I've looked into great detail. But what's guided me has been instinct. There's certain things, and also how some of my teachers have responded to various authors, and through that you get a sense of, who's on which side of the heresy debate. In general, we try to limit the number of heretics, so we try to work as much as possible to broaden the boundaries of Torah, Torah true Jews. Try to make that community the larger community. We're not trying to find heretics, apikosim, but it's important to know that they exist, and that we have to treat what they say differently to the way that we treat somebody who takes Torah min hashamayim seriously.
Yeah, because the action depends on that. If I would put it in Geniza or burn
Yeah,
it,
correct.
and then if I would burn it, something that wouldn't be heresy.
Yeah, you're basically going to be high because you're careful.
Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. Then I
Yeah,
would
you've got the
become a
same
heretic.
text. Am I supposed to be putting this on my bookshelf or burning it? So when I was a kid, it was quite clear to us that any of the books that were handed us, there was an organization in England, a Christian organization that would target Jewish children. So there was no doubt that was really there was no question, no sort of authentic Jew, no Orthodox Jew really questioned whether those books needed to be destroyed or not. On concerning other books, I don't know if we need to destroy, books by people that we disagree with, and we try to broaden the boundaries of non-apikosim. We try to make that community
More inclusive.
Yeah, we try to make that exactly. Try to make that a small community, but do know that they exist. And often our teachers can be very helpful in helping us pick up on the nuance and understand who are the people I should be learning from and who are the people that perhaps, at this stage of my life, it would be good not to learn from them until I've got a solid basis in what I believe in. Good question. I just want to, is that okay? That answer your question? I want to share one more point before we I want to talk about God's name in other languages, but it sort of connects, what I want to say now connects a little bit to that. I want to tell you a story. We were talking just now about what makes a book holy isn't just the text that happens to be written on the page, but what also makes a difference to the holiness of the book is also the intent of the person nowadays printing, but then writing the words on the page. And that's what we've just been addressing very briefly. So I want to tell you a very quick story, very, very sweet story. I heard this story when our oldest daughter was 6 and she was in first grade, and they did this big ceremony in her school in order to present the girls who would just learn how to read Hebrew for the first time. In first grade, you learn how to read Hebrew, and the first book that you're given when you learn how to read in Hebrew, the first book you're given is a Siddur. And there's a big ceremony in school to get the Siddur. At the ceremony, one of the teachers, her name is Rivka Rappaport, told such a sweet story that's pertinent for our discussion here. And Mrs. Rappaport told a story about the Chofetz Chaim, Rav Yisrael Meir Kagan from Radin, and he lived well into his 90s, maybe even more, but I think he lived into his 90s. So it was his 80th birthday, and his family were thinking, what should we buy Abba, Saba Rabba, what should we buy him for his birthday? So an 80-year-old Gadol Ador, it's very hard to know what would they like. And one of the children had this idea. They knew he's been using the same Siddur maybe since he was 13 years old. It's over 60, close to 70 years old, this Siddur. It's falling apart. We're going to buy him a brand new, beautiful Siddur. And That's what they did. They presented the Chofetz Chaim on his birthday with this new beautiful siddur to replace his old siddur that's really very much falling apart. And he refused to accept the gift. And he said, this siddur, this holy book, it contains prayers and tears and thoughts and ideas that I've been communicating with HaKadosh Baruch Hu for close to 70 years. This is my journal. It might have, I might be reading the same words every day, but every day when I've said Shema Yisrael or Hashem Safata Tiftach, it's been a new day and a new world, a new life. It's not an old book. It's really like my 70 years of my life are bound up in these pages. So I'm not going to exchange it for something that's a blank piece of paper with a new siddur. But what we see from this, she took it in lots of directions, this beautiful story. But in our context, we understand that this holy page from the Chofetz Chaim Siddur, what makes it holy isn't just the words written on the page, but this page has absorbed 70 years of tears and of hope and of prayer. And that's part of what makes a holy book holy. And that reflects a little bit in what the Rambam was saying, that when a book is written by a Torah true Jew, so then it's not just the words that are printed on the page, but it's also the intent of the person writing those words that make it into the holy book that it is. And this idea, the story of the Chofetz Chaim and the Halacha that we saw in the Rambam are really very much connected with one another. Okay, with that, I want to turn to our second question. We've got, two questions. We spoke about God's name. We're going to speak now about God's name in English. And then afterwards, the final topic is disposing of holy books. So let's go to what do we do if God's name is written in a language other than Hebrew? And on that, I'd like to learn two sources. First one, both of them written in the last 300 years. The first one, Shach. The Shach is a commentator, Sefer Torah. He's a commentator on the Shulchan Aruch. And he writes, on the Shulchan Aruch, Yoredeh Semen Kuf Ayin Tet, Hashem b'li Ekdesh hu Shem, aval b'lashon chol eino Shem klal. V'agatz mechad taham mutar limchot, Shem shenechtam b'lashon chol. He said, God's name, this is the Shulchan Aruch who's quoting the Rambam about erasing God's name. And the Shach is quite emphatic in saying that what's forbidden is God's name in Hebrew letters, meaning it's bringing the letter Yud together with the word Vav, together with the word Yud, and then a Hey, and then a Vav, and then finally another Hey, putting those letters together, that creates God's name. So if I take a G and an O and a D, I didn't create anything. That's not holy letters, that's English. That's not Lashon HaKodesh. So he writes, Lashon Chol. If I write God's name in another language other than Hebrew, they're like section 4, on the second line of the Shach. But Lashon Chol Kamo Got. Do you see that? Got. Gal. He writes God's name in English with Hebrew letters. But Lashon Ashkenaz, or it's German. Nachon? Bog. Who speaks Russian? Nachon? That's Nachon? Bog. Slava Boka, נכון? זה ברוך השם. אז בואו בלשון פולין ורוסיה כי יוצא בזה. Polin, there you are. So he's saying that if you were to say, how do you say God's name in Polish? Bóg. So Bóg, Bog, God. So those words have no holiness. There's no holiness in Polish or in English or in Russian. So therefore, I'm allowed to erase God's name in languages other than Hebrew. So we see from the Shach that what makes things holy is the Hebrew letters. This could have important ramifications for the room in which we find ourselves because we are in the English library here at the Machon. So if we say it's the English library, so the majority of the books here would not be, it would be easier to dispose of these books because they're not written B'Lashon HaKodesh. Okay, yes.
Does it apply to Yiddish and Aramaic, since they are in the
Oh,
Hebrew
good
letters?
question. No, I think he's only talking about Lashon HaKodesh, meaning there's Hebrew and every other letter, every other language. Even if I wrote it's not the Hebrew letters. If I write Bog, Nachon, Bog, Beit, Vav, Gimel, Bog, that's not God's name. Even if I wrote with the Hebrew letters, it's God's name in Hebrew. It's a connect. It's really putting those letters together.
I believe that Mama Lotion would be much more complicated case, actually.
Yeah.
It's not Aramaic, actually, but
Yiddish.
Yiddish.
Could be. Now that's the Shach. I have to say, a lot disagree with the Shach. A lot of people disagree with the Shach. We're going to look at the Achiezer. Achiezer is Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski. He lived in the 19th and early 20th century. He passed away just before the Second World War. Okay, and he wrote a book of Shutim. I'm just going to see if I can jump a little bit in what he says. Okay, so he says, he doesn't like writing in God's name, even if it's not in even if it's in other languages. He quotes the state. One second. Okay, I'm gonna go. On the second line. ועל כן, אם כי היה נכון לכתחילה לשנות ולהביא מילה אחרת, כמו אביגה שבר, או לעשות כמו שנהוג אצלנו לעשות קו מפריד בין האות ג' לאות ט', או בכל אופן שימצאו עצה לתקן להוציא מידי חשש אורים, ומה שלא חשש לזה, there was a book, somebody printed a book and they wrote G-O-D in the book in English, and they're asking this Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grudzinski about how to deal with this book, or also in newspapers as well. And Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski says it would be better to write G-D rather than G-O-D. So God, G-O-D, is everybody knows that's referring to God, and therefore it would be a problem to write G-O-D, different to what we saw in the Shach. So therefore there's, that the word God in English is referring to the same HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we call in Hebrew Yud Kei Vav Kei, and therefore just like in Hebrew I need to treat wherever it appears with reverence, so too when it appears in English there should be no difference. Okay, I'm going to go now to the 4 lines from the bottom. Mikol makom, אם הדבר קשה אצלם לתקן ולשנות כלפי הנהוג, אפשר לצטט דעיתון שבועי חשוב כמו, I don't know what that word is, Israelite. What is it, Israelite? What?
But this is the way
אינם נוהגים בו מנהג ביזיון, maybe it's a magazine, לפי שאין בו דברי תורה ופוסקים, וגם בלשון הקודש, ונכון לפרסם בעיתון שלא ינהגו בו מנהג ביזיון משום הפוסקים את דברי תורה, ובאופן שיפרסמו כן, שהמנהג כמו שהיו נוהגים עד עתה בכתיבת השם בלעז. So he writes, the Achiezer writes that really writing God's name in English does not seem to be that different to writing God's name in Hebrew. And if I was cautious about throwing away something that contains God's name in Hebrew, I should be likewise cautious about disposing of God's name in another language. So we see there's a debate. I think most people really follow today more the position of the Achiezer. And I wonder whether, just thinking out loud here, it could be, we said that there's 2 aspects. There's really 2 ideas that combine together in order to make a holy book holy. First thing is holy words, psukim, Mishnayot, Talmud, even Torah thoughts being shared on paper. That is one thing. And the second thing is the intent of the person. Nachon? A non-apikoros, as we discussed earlier. So it's the text, the actual words, and then the intent of the person writing the words. So it could be that for the shach, he's focusing more on the word, meaning this is a word in English. What's forbidden is the holy letters. You follow? Yud, K, Vav, K. It's the letters that make it holy. And then the Achiezer might say, it is the letters, but it's not just that. It's also the intent of the person who's writing it. So if I, a Torah observant Jew, write an article, and in that article I refer to God, and I wrote it in English because I'm writing to people who speak in English. So I, in writing God, mean exactly the same as what he means when he's writing in Hebrew, God's name in Hebrew. And therefore, just like I need to treat the word with respect in Hebrew, so too I would need to treat the word with respect in English. You follow? That for the shach, it's more about the letters, and for the achiezer, it's more about the intent. And therefore, the shach is less concerned about English words, and the achiezer is more worried about English words. Joy? Okay. Nowadays, la halacha, we tend to follow more the achiezer, and we treat holy books in English, or in any non-Hebrew language, we treat them with reverence, as we would also treat with reverence books written in Hebrew. So we're talking about piles of books last week. So if I have one of the Sefer Kodesh here, and then I have some Shakespeare, so the Sefer Kodesh go on top, irrespective of the language in which they were written, following sort of the Achiezer position. Is that clear to everybody? Okay. Now the question is, what do I do with books, or lav dafka books? What do I do with, let's say, a newspaper, or an article, or even these beautiful pieces of paper? What am I going to do with them at the end of the shiur? You follow the question? So we're going to start with the Shulchan Aruch, and then after the Shulchan Aruch, we're going to go to Rav Moshe Feinstein, who lived about 40 years ago in America, and then to Pinei Halacha, who's over here, Rav Melamed, who lives now in Har Bracha, here in Israel. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch says like this, and this is really the source of everything that we are, the source of the idea of a Geniza. The Shulchan Aruch tells us in the laws of a Sefer Torah, point number 5, you see that? Sefer Torah shebala, a Sefer Torah that is getting worn out, or shenifsal, or it's become, there's a mistake in it. So notnim oto b'chli cheres. You put it into a clay container, v'kovrin oto etil talmid chacham, and the custom is for it to be buried next to the grave of a talmid chacham. V'zo hi genizato, and this is its genizato. Genizato, lignoz means to hide something, but it means that this is the way that we respectfully, look after something when it's at the end of its life. Okay, so that's the Shulchan Aruch. Again, the Shulchan Aruch is talking before printing, so there's very few texts, and he's really talking about Sefer Torah. The question of a Geniza today is a much, much bigger question than it was even 100 years ago. 100 years ago, they never had photocopiers. You probably know about this. There's a shul in Cairo.
The famous Geniza.
Fustat, I think it was. That's right. And there was, through the centuries, the Jewish community in Cairo was doing well, they're not so well. It depended sort of if it was the Crusaders or then afterwards and the Muslims, and they destroyed many, many of the Batei Knesset. And for some reason, there's this one shul in Cairo that wasn't destroyed despite all the ups and downs of the Jewish community. And many ancient shuls were destroyed, But this shul survived, and then in the 19th century, almost by chance, a room in the shul where people deposited their holy writings was discovered, and it was like a treasure trove of ancient manuscripts, many writings of the Rambam in his own handwriting, because he lived in Egypt, were found in this geniza, and there was eventually this ancient room was brought to Cambridge in England, where it is now preserved. Every once in a while, they have exhibitions from the geniza in different places. But if ever any of you are in Cambridge, you should definitely, if you're able, to go to see the geniza and see some of these ancient writings that were really able to fill up, lots of gaps in Jewish history, to understand the Jewish community for over 1,000 years. But the joke is, I don't know if the joke's not the right word, it was 1,000 years of Jewish writings in a prosperous Jewish city filled up a room. Unfortunately, today with photocopying, it would take about a week to fill up the same space with the amount of the Knesset that with all the Sedra sheets and source materials and other things that people produce every day. So then it was a much bigger deal to create a work with Torah writing on it. But nowadays, these things, like a Geniza, gets filled up much more quickly than in the olden days. Anyway, so that's the Rambam. Not the Rambam, although the Shulchan Aruch is based on the Rambam, but the Shulchan Aruch tells us that holy books are put into a clay container and they're buried in a cemetery. We bury holy things in a cemetery, ideally next to the grave of a Talmid Chacham. So now the question is, what needs to be put into a geniza? What goes into the geniza nowadays? So I want to go now to Rav Moshe Feinstein. But in order to say, I'm going to read the question, and then I'm going to go down. Let me read you a question. A few minutes ago, I told you a story
About the
Rivka Rappaport.
granddaughter.
Yes, and it's her husband that. Yes, you're on the ball.
She was a witness in my wedding.
Wow, how was your connection?
To my wife.
And how they connected?
Their children lived together with my wife in Berlin.
Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. Rav Shabtai Rappaport, is a grandson of the Shemi Shmuel, who we often quote from Sokochov in Poland, which is very interesting. So this question to Rivka Rappaport's grandfather her grandfather was Rav Moshe Feinstein, and her husband, Rav Shabtai, asked the question that we're going to look at his answer. So let's read the question. It's in point 5. You'll see it mentioned. Sifrei Kodesh, holy books, nitpasim, printed holy books, shebalu, that they've become worn out. Im mutar litzitam lekelim shelochim otam misham v'tochanim otam umochakim otam lasot niyar chadash. Are you allowed to take holy books, printed books, Sedra sheets, and are you allowed not to throw them away, but to put them into a recycling center? Because it's a waste of paper. Can I recycle this paper, or is that considered blotting out God's name? That was the question that was asked, and look who asked the question. The question was asked on the 22nd of Adar, Taf Shin Mem. Taf Shin Mem is 1980. Okay. Mima'alat Kvodo, it comes from my grandson, the husband of my granddaughter. Ahuv Lanu Mod, very much loved granddaughter and grandson. Harav HaGaon, Rav Shabtai Avraham HaKohen Rappaport. Do you see that? Who was at your wedding? That's amazing. Thank you so much, Chaim. I'm so happy for so many reasons that you're here, and that's just another reason. So with your permission, I'm going to miss out, just to save time. I'm going to go to the bottom, the second paragraph. He writes, Le'inyan Ma'aseh, practically. הוא ברור אצלי, כמו שכתבתי, ויש איסור בחומשים וספרי תנ"ך שבהם נמצאים שמות. It's quite clear that you could never recycle a chumash, a book of Tanakh, or any book that contains God's name in it. Any book that contains God's name in it, written by a Torah observant Jew. V'chein sidurim, and likewise sidurim. See, Rivka Rappaport would never recycle a siddur because she knows the story of the Chovetz Chaim and she would want to use the worn out sidurim of the holiest ones. Anyway, Aval, me'asfarim shebetorah sheba'al peh, concerning oral Torah, shehem mishnayot u'gemara, if it's Mishnah or Gemara, Mishnah Talmudim, v'chol sifrei Rabboteinu Rishonim v'achronim, and books written by later scholars, and Svarim HaNitbasim b'Chochmei Hazman, and books that are printed nowadays by contemporary Torah scholars, v'chol hayarchonim shenikru, or any journals, a Torah journal that was printed. You know, there's lots of Torah magazines that come out. ולא שייך שילמדו ויענו בהם, אף ששייך שילמדו מהם לפעמים, אך ברור שלא ילמדו ולא יענו בהם, כאיזה דפים שלמים נמי מותר. So he says over here, it seems to me that if there are books that don't contain any names of God, right, and it's not from the Torah or the Tanakh, well, not from Torah, Nevi'im, or Ketuvim. So let's say there's an English book from here that's worn out. So the book is worn out and I can't learn Torah from that book anymore. Right? So what makes the book holy is not just the writing, what's written on the book, but also the fact that it's a book that I can learn Torah from. If its function as a Torah vessel is no longer available, I can't study from it anymore, and it doesn't contain any holy names of God, then I would be allowed to recycle it. That's what Rav Moshe Feinstein says, but I just want to add one thing. One second. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. בורא נפשות רבות וחסרונן על כל מה שבאת לחיות בהם נפש כולך ברוך העולמים. Now look what he says at the end. This is very important. אבל לעשות כן למעשה, to actually do that, תדבר בזה עם עוד גדולי הפוסקים בארץ ישראל וגם גדולי ראש הישיבה וגם עם גדולי תורה והוראה מהעדה החרדית והספרדים. הנני זקנך, I'm your grandfather who loves you very dearly, Rav Moshe Feinstein. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, based on his study, he thinks that you can recycle holy books that are no longer available for learning as long as there's no Torah in it, no Nevi'im in it, no Ketuvim in it, and no God's name in it. Right? However, that's a very big responsibility to take on your shoulders. So let's say that some of the books over here, some of the books over here, there's a commentary on Pirkei Avot over here, or there's even like over here in English, Pinine Halacha in English. So there's no Torah, it's contemporary Halacha. Would I be allowed, and it's worn out and I can't study it anymore? So Rav Moshe Feinstein would say, I think you can recycle it. However, that's a very, very big question. And he suggests his grandson, Rav Shabtai, that he consult with more people in order to determine what to do. Meaning he's hesitant to permit recycling that paper, and therefore, even though it's his, it seems to him that that's something that should be permissible, but he doesn't want to take the responsibility of such a big decision, of erasing God's name potentially. He doesn't want to take that decision by himself, and he asks his grandson to consult other people and then to reach his conclusion. So he said what he says, but it's not a practical answer, because I don't know what to do with the book now. So for a sort of 50 years after Rav Moshe Feinstein? No, that was 1980, so 40 years, maybe 35 to 40 years later, Pinine Halacha, Rav Melamed. I point over there. For anyone on the video is wondering why I'm pointing here, pointing there, the books are over here. Anyway, so Pinine Halacha, Rav Melamed does give a ruling, and he talks about Sedra sheets. You know, the alonim that we see on Shabbatot. What do I do with them? So let's read what he says about that, and then we can come back to and then I'll say one word about the books. Ma'amadam shel dapei parashat shavua, hamechulakim b'vatei hakneset, Sedra sheets. Even things like the Torah tidbits that you get here at Machon Meir. You know, the alonim that come out every week. Gavoa yoter ma'amadam shel itonim sheish beim divrei Torah. So there's a difference between, let's say, the Jerusalem Post with which is like the big Friday edition with all these inserts, and then one page Devar Torah. There's a difference between that and an alon that's really basically Divrei Torah and Parashat Shavua. When I look at this Sedra sheet, you think, maybe I'll find something nice for my Shabbat table reading this alon. Nachon, when you see in the newspaper, it's really, I shouldn't spend all day on Shabbat reading the news, so therefore there's also a Devar Torah, but it's not, I don't look at the Jerusalem Post and say, Sefer Kodesh. I don't look at the newspaper and say, here's a holy book, but I might, when I take one of the alonim, say, I haven't learned all day, let me read something in this alon. So it's written as a Torah publication, as opposed to a newspaper that's not written as a Torah publication. Note, in brackets, how the intent is an important factor that I may not intuitively have thought about in thinking about I might have thought it's just what letters appear on the page, but intent seems to be relevant, and through that I distinguish between a newspaper and a Torah journal. Let's continue. V'chein nira. Therefore it appears to me, Shedat Rova Poskim L'chayvam B'Gniza. Most would say that you do need to put alonim in a gniza. Omnam, yesh svara lahakel behem ipnei shehem no'adu lilimud chad pami. Va'al yedei v'yesh omrim shelo nitkadshu, kavi shemashma b'tshuvat hanetziv. V'chein lefi dat igrot Moshe quotes Rav Moshe Feinstein, lachar kama limud behem paska kedushatam lefichach yesh lemekilim amal ismoch. Okay, so he says, concerning these alonim, the alon is written to be studied once. There's a big difference between a Torah book and a Torah Friday evening publication. They come out once a week. You read it that week, and like a newspaper, you throw it away. The alonim are like newspapers as opposed to a history book. And therefore, Rav Melamed says there's a very strong reason to allow people to recycle alonim, based on what Rav Moshe Feinstein said, because you're not going to learn from it again. There's some things I'm not going to learn from again because they're worn out, and things like this I'm not going to learn from again because it's a one-time study. Now Rav Melamed says what he thinks. La'aniyut da'ati, the last line. שנכון לנהוג לכתחילה שאם רוב הגיליון מוקדש לפרסום וזו מגמתו דינו כעיתון ואפשר להניחו באופן מחובר בפח ואם עיקרו לקדושה נכון לגונזו. So how does he decide what to do? Look at the alon, look at the Torah sheet. If you see that it's full of adverts, like half adverts, half Torah, so then you can recycle it, because there's so many reasons to be lenient, and that it is primarily a Torah journal, but in order to pay for it, there's so many adverts. It's not really a Torah journal. But if you have a Torah journal with a donor, and therefore it's a weekly Torah journal, and it's only for one time, but when I open it, it's just Divrei Torah, then I would need to put that in Geniza. You follow? So I have a difference between something that's entirely Torah and something that's with adverts. If it's entirely Torah, Geniza, and if it's adverts, then I would not need to put it in Geniza. Concerning the holy books of Rav Moshe Feinstein, I just see from the Geniza near our home, and also the people are cautious. Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote, it seems to me that you can recycle it. In practice, I don't see people recycling holy books. I see people, there's a big Geniza near our home. People, they're worn out Jewish books, they take to the Geniza. So the hesitation written, Rav Moshe Feinstein, meaning theoretically, I think you can, but speak to other people. It seems either his grandson did speak to other people, or the Jewish community all took from his hesitation, and we continue with that. And the only things we really recycle today are newspapers with a little Devar Torah in it, or an alon, a Torah alon that's full of adverts. That there may be a couple of Devar Torah, but there's so many adverts in it that I can recycle it, and everything else I do put into Geniza. Sweet, wonderful people, it's a joy and an honor to learn with you. Yashar koach to all of you.